Let's talk about America today and what's wrong with it. So, the way I'm going to go about this is I'll talk about what the fundamentals are, and then we'll talk about how that applies to today. And then we'll go through how this is like we're writing a high school essay. We're looking at it politically, economically, socially. So, let's start with this political thing. What is America? It's a democracy. It's got a constitution. It's got supposedly checks and balances. And all of that is mixed in with a lot of lies. They're lies because it doesn't really work the way they sold it to you, the way that you were maybe taught. So the first thing to realize is that democracies are inherently plutocratic. And what's a plutocracy? It means that the wealthy control governing. So when you understand it to be that way, you want to acknowledge that it's not only that the wealthy control government, is that it's a reality. So that's different from oligarchy because I see this mistake a lot. An oligarchy is something where the law says you have to have a certain amount of property in order to engage politically. For example, you need to be a landowner in order to be able to cast a vote. That's one kind of oligarchy. Now you could set that price amount up or down, but the idea is the same. It's outright. And that's actually better than a plutocracy because a plutocracy functions by direct expenditure of wealth, but it's harder. I mean, you're not directly buying votes. I should have said maybe it's indirect. So the way it works is that you use money to compete with other people's influence. And when you're talking about democracy, that money is going to be spent trying to persuade some number of voters, known as swing voters, to go one direction or the other. Because most people are not principled, most people are not well thought out. And so a little bit more advertising money or whatever else is going to go push the direction one way or the other. And there's other ways that the money plays into the larger system. But anyway, suffice it to say, any kind of democracy ends up being plutocracy because of that reason. That there's a lot of people who don't really understand what's going on, or they're not really principled, and so it's going to be easy to emotionally persuade them towards one direction or the other. And a lot of you have seen this already because you've already seen a lot of people, all of a sudden their opinions have changed really wildly, really drastically. And that's not by accident. That happens with the expenditure of money. And a lot of times it's not out in the open. Nobody is declaring they're paying for this. And furthermore, when you exert that influence, when you buy that influence, it's going to be in the form of some kind of advertising or even in the form of somebody pretending to be a, I don't know, content creator that's just some random dude. But in fact, if you look at his stuff, if you look at how well polished it all is, you realize there's a lot of time and a lot of help he's been getting. And usually that is enabled through a paycheck. So that's really important to understand. I don't really have all these great videos, even in the era of AI, because I only am one guy and I only have so much time. So that's really important to understand. A lot of you guys out there in a New York Times poll voted Idiocracy to be the most representative movie of America at its supposed 250th year of existence, and I've put up other stuff criticizing that notion that somehow the Declaration of Independence marks the birth of a nation, and that same nation has still somehow survived. There's a lot going wrong with that idea. One, America was a thing long before the Declaration of Independence. In fact, you could say that these colonial elites, they were wealthy and well connected, kind of hijacked that, you know. But anyways, um, that America that was established has died and been reborn several times in the last 250 years. Certainly by the Civil War, and certainly in the aftermath of the Second World War. Those are some really obvious time points. And certainly by 2001, it's been changed again. So, anyways, the thing is, you guys all, a lot of people at least, they voted for idiocracy because I think deep down inside, you know, that's actually how democracies really do function. It rewards stupidity. It empowers stupidity. And then because they collectively, the stupid, set the laws and the policies, all right, because of that power, the wealthy can indirectly guide people towards self-defeating measures so that ordinary people who are really smart, and let's be honest here, the guys running these companies, they aren't really all that bright. They're lucky, they're connected, and they were born into money, but they're not all really all that bright. But the people who are actually intelligent, and then among those who are good-hearted, those people have it the hardest in a democracy. And so, like Idiocracy predicts, because it becomes harder and harder for people who have a good heart and are intelligent to be able to raise children, over time, you see less and less of those kinds of people. So, my point, though, overall, is that deep down inside, you know democracy doesn't really work. So that's it politically. Now, constitutionally, I could say a lot more there, but the checks and balances aren't really working. The Supreme Court is really institutionally, in order to get on there, you have to be something of a sycophant. You can't really speak the truth. Otherwise, it'll come out and bite you before you can get appointed. Other things I could point out is that America's best president of all time isn't really George Washington. It's actually probably, yeah, I'm not saying this guy is anywhere close to perfect. He was really wrong about a lot of international relations type of things. But Theodore Roosevelt did a lot for the common people. And how did he become president the first time? By accident. How did he become vice president? Also, this was not really an accident, but the Republican Party was tired of him making changes as the governor of New York, so they decided to give him a kind of sinecure, meaning a job position where you get paid but you don't do much. And that's the vice presidency. And so they thought they were just gonna, you know, kick him up upstairs, I think was a phrase that they used, so that nobody would really hear from him and he wouldn't really be able to do anything. But then, of course, McKinley dies. So that's its own kind of story. But anyways, the checks and balances are not really all that good. You want real checks and balances. Look at the Confucian system, particularly after, say, the Sung Dynasty. All right, and it's not only China that uses this; it's also what we call today Korea, what we today call Vietnam. They have something that is translated to English as the censorate. These guys are actually well staffed, and they are well funded, and they are basically independent, and there's a lot of them, and their only sole exclusive job is to investigate other government officials for things like malfeasance, corruption, bribery, but also they also looked at the policies that were implemented, see if they really worked, and then independently argued against them if they were immoral. So you don't have to go file a lawsuit with a bunch of other people, a lawsuit that'll take years and years to get to the Supreme Court, who again is filled with professional sycophants, and then eventually have it kicked out for not very good reason, because this is just it's just 9 judges, and really they have very little power. That's why, throughout history, there are certain people who are, of course, killed in the name of power, right? You know what the word for that obviously is. But that happens to people who actually hold power. That's never happened to a Supreme Court judge because they're powerless. And you could stuff the court. I mean, I could keep going on and on and on here. What about today? You see all these problems today. You see a celebrity, a guy who has never really built business, a guy who's great at marketing. Now, I would love a Donald Trump to promote my, I don't know, channel or my books. I would love somebody like that. But the thing about promoters is that that's one kind of skill set. It doesn't mean they are deep thinkers. It doesn't mean that they are strategic thinkers. It doesn't mean they are leaders. I mean, they're leaders of the crowd in a sense, and maybe sort of mob leaders, you can say, but they're not really leaders who think 50 years in advance. And that's another problem with democracy, is too short term by structure. These terms, right? They only go for 4 years. Anyways, it's a broken system. And you see the Supreme Court, they're spineless. They've been spineless for a very long time. And it happened a long time before Trump ever sniffed the presidency. And you see Congress, they're unprincipled. They can't even get together on something like this stupid Iranian war that we shouldn't be in. They can't even get together to make a stand. The whole thing is just broken. So politically, that's how America works. Economically, no, you've probably heard a lot about capitalism, free market. Capitalism good, free market good. I'm here to tell you that those are not the same thing. So if you look at the root word, ism and capital, right? If you're looking at something ism, it's a way of life where that idea is central to it. So if you say, oh, this is materialism, this is a materialistic society, you're saying that they are all about things of a physical nature, they ignore the spiritual things. So if you look at how those words work, you could think about the same about capitalism. It's where everything revolves around capital. But capital is essentially wealth. So is America capitalist? Yes, but it's not free market. It's not free market because free market means a lack of regulations, in terms of people exchanging goods. Now, America is highly regulated, but it's regulated in a very particular kind of way. It's regulated in favor of those who hold capital. It's not regulated in favor of protecting the common people, except for rare times. So when you have certain regulations, it's really there to keep you from competing with the guys who are basically an oligopoly. All right. So let's say you want to get into, for example, it's just a really simple example. Okay, there's a lot more examples that we could talk about, but let's say you want to buy some stock in a foreign company. Okay, that's going to be more regulated than if you buy stock in an American company or one that's traded on an American index. Now, this might, on the surface of things, start to make sense, but it really doesn't. These are just rules to get you to keep your money within to the big companies that already exist and not to some company out there that might be growing, right? You could always come with some excuse. Oh, well, it's more dangerous that way. And, well, why does it matter? It's your money. It's your gamble. So why are you getting in the way? Doesn't really make all too much sense. Now, that's an example of when I don't, some of this is sort of government related regulations, and some of this is done through the corporation that you might be using to purchase stocks. So there are other examples, in the world of medicine, sugar, technology, even credit ratings. There's just a lot of that there to serve as a barrier into entry to compete. But beyond that, you've also got this problem where government is subsidizing one company over the other. I mean, just look at all of Elon Musk's activities, right? Heavily subsidized, right? How does this guy become so wealthy? Because his stuff is subsidized. How does he, out of other people, how does his business get subsidized, right? That's where these connections happen. So are you really dealing with a free market? No, it's an unfair market. It's not really competitive. And even the failure to uh, actually use antitrust laws. And so that's why if we go back to Theodore Roosevelt, he's really different. He actually used those antitrust laws and really used them as the executive to make things better for the common American, the average American, whatever you want to call them. And so that's not what's happening today, right? So it's the other way around. We turn a blind eye to all these obvious oligopolies out there, right? All these obvious um, big players that need to be broken up. And then what we do is we give them even more money. So it's not really the same thing at all. All right. So if we're thinking about economically, what we have here is a nation run by merchants. That's a businessman is or an entrepreneur. Those are fancy terms for merchants. A merchant is really some guy who is wanting to take money and make it into larger money one way or the other. Now you might do that through some kind of uh, intermediate means, right? But you these guys are driven by money. Is my point. They're not driven by this idea of an invention that'll help everybody. The invention is a way to get more money out of the system. And that's why in the last 20 or so years, what we see is these so-called inventions. They don't really make people happier. They don't really stabilize their lives. They don't really make them give you something that's truly useful. Okay. Instead, what you have, especially with something like the generic social media, right? Instead, what you have is a way to get people to maybe get addicted to these things, uh, to um, maybe make them trap them into some kind of subscription. It's not really there to make their lives a better place. And I think a good example of that is all the crap, all the garbage material that Hollywood is pumping out. Because if you look at that, the quality of storytelling is extremely poor, but it's flashy and it's attention grabbing. I think The Boys is a good example of that. That's something that could have been finished in 2 seasons, maybe 3, and they still stretched it out until people really complain. And Game of Thrones, the appearance of some kind of deep insight into politics, and it wasn't. And that's why ultimately that book series is never going to be finished, because you can tell that the bad ideas that they came out with that satisfied no one, that was probably the original plan of Martin. And so when you have that, it's really discouraging as an author to finish the whole series, knowing that people will probably just not like it anyway, no matter how well you execute it. So, that book series is never going to finish. But anyways, we have that kind of thing going on. Now, plutocracy and capitalism, they're almost the same, two sides of the same coin. One is more about the political facing end. The other one is about the more economic facing end. Okay. But those two things, politically and economically, force together and create culture. So we're at the third category, the third dimension, social, culturally, okay, even religiously, say, and spiritually and morally, because those are all tied together when we're talking about a whole polity, whether you're an empire, you're a country, you're a kingdom. All right. So the Confucians, right, the Ru, if you want to use the original term, they thought about this very carefully. So, a lot of times you read Confucius and he seems very almost bland, almost boring, because he says something that we would all agree on, or nobody would at least disagree on. For example, oh, you should respect your parents. Nobody's ever going to say that. That in general people shouldn't respect their parents. Now they might personally not respect their own parents. That's true, but nobody will, as a category, argue against this. All right. Even something like respect your elders, I think we all kind of basically know some sense of that, and I think it takes kind of you know, honestly, it's a little twisted to say something against that, right? Like, oh, we should just, you know, we should not have any kind of respect for somebody who's older. Yeah, we all know that basically somebody who's older than you know, it doesn't mean he's right about everything or even most things. It just means that um, you don't push him around like you would. You know, you don't tease him or whatever the way that you would with somebody who's just your age. All right. So there's some degree of instinctual deference there. All right. So, anyways, look, it seems like Confucius says some very bland things, but then he hits you with something that's really insightful, such as, you know, you could have these laws and you could reward them with incentives or punish them, but ultimately they will just learn how to avoid breaking the law. But if you use li, which is a word that's hard to translate, it means something like ritual propriety, but just think about it in terms of culture, right? So if you use culture and you use personal virtue in the form of leadership to lead, then you're going to actually transform them, right? That's 2.3. Okay. You could find it, look it up. Um, you could go look for it. This is my paraphrase of it, right? So laws can only work so well because people will just avoid breaking them, or at least, no, more specifically, they won't avoid breaking them. They'll just try to avoid the punishment. Okay, so you've got some people, they'll break the law, but they'll avoid getting punished. You'll find some people who follow the law, but their hearts are not transformed by the law. Okay, so instead, what you use is culture, and your leaders exemplify virtue. All right, and that brings about a sense of shame. It changes the conscience, inspires them to be different. And that's how that works. Because culture is actually the most important thing a government is concerned with. It's not about money. It's not even about something like building roads. It's not really even about protecting property. Although, if you live in a place where your private property rights are not being respected, that's savagery. You're no longer living in a civilization at that point. All right. Even something like if you feel like you need absolutely to own a gun in order to protect yourself, you live in a state of savagery. All right. Now, I'm not saying one thing or the other about uh, gun rights or anything. What I'm saying is if you feel like you actually need the gun to protect yourself, you're not living in a safe place. Okay. So that's really important to understand. Okay. So culturally, how does this all work? How does America work? It's very individualistic. All right. It's very materialistic. Okay. So if you want to figure out how to solve an issue, you got to spend money or you got to change something about yourself. That's that ends up being the solutions almost all the time. Okay. And so what what do other countries what are they supposed to do? Let me put it that way. Okay, let's not think about what other countries today are doing that because American influence is very wide, right? And other countries are also democracies, and other countries are also capitalist. So, what are we supposed to do? All right. What what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to have good culture, and that good culture is supposed to inspire us towards what is good, so that we spontaneously act that way. So all this Hollywood stuff, all this stuff that basically promotes adultery, that promotes promiscuity, that shows people being happy because they decide to follow their own individual, which often really means selfish desires. That shows you, I don't know, there's also all sorts of misleading things. Like, for example, people being really happy with their dogs. I I don't understand this because, okay, um, I used to own a dog, and we had a family dog, and you know, I still miss her a lot. Um, but but the thing is, she was work to raise and to keep, and um, the reality is that if you're going to put in this kind of work and etc., into a living being, you should have children. You should instead have children. And it really doesn't make sense to put this effort into a dog. And ultimately, dogs are not really supposed to be, there's such a thing as a village dog, and that's how dogs usually lived. Okay, they weren't cooped up in somebody's house or their backyard, only to be taken on a walk maybe once a day if they're lucky. All right, what it used to be is that this dog would just kind of be out there, and they would roam. All right, they would, dogs are curious, and they're not supposed to be barking all the time, not knowing what's beyond the door or beyond the fence. So they would be out there sniffing whatever they want, looking here and there. All right. They might come home. Okay. And then that was happiness for them. And if you can't really provide that, it's actually, you have to recognize that your dog's life is miserable. All right. That's just one example. All right. But culturally, America is just really screwed up. I mean, today, look at this. You have all this divorce. And if you don't have this divorce, people don't get married in the first place. But if you move in together and you share your bills together and you even raise your children together, what is that? That's a marriage, but you only skipped the marriage ceremony. And so let's say you go to college, you move in with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and then at the end of it, you split. You don't see each other anymore. Well, spiritually speaking, psychologically speaking, that's a divorce. It's only that you didn't get the marriage ceremony out of it, but it's a divorce because you lived a completely married life for that amount of time. And so those statistics are really misleading. And we have Hollywood, they're totally irresponsible. It's not just a Hollywood thing, by the way. All right. Uh, we see this in not only films and television, music engages in this too. Maybe that's technically Hollywood too. But we have those things happening, right? If you look at our leadership, it's no longer a scandal to be divorced. It's no longer an indication you might not be somebody who can lead through your virtue. So that whole concept is gone, right? It's more of like, what does this guy do for me? All right. But that's short-term thinking. That's short-term thinking because you don't see that people emulate those who have power. And it's not only political power, we're talking about people who are wealthy. You see all those guys, and they are spiritually empty. Right? These people who have billions of dollars and still want to make more money, there's something wrong with them. They're addicted to this, and they're very materialistic. You see them get divorces, and you see that they're estranged from their own children. And that are all indications they are not fit to be role models. And yet those are the ones who have all this power. So they're going to transform the culture in their own image. They're going to be the ones that inspire the young. And so it's not a surprise that every time you have a change in the president, the way he talks, the way he acts, how brash he is, how confident he is, right? That gets emulated by the young. It's not a coincidence, right? Don't think of it's a kind of chicken egg dynamic, right? The reason why he gets elected is because people are kind of going towards that. But once he's elected, he sets a role model, and then you have reinforcement. So culturally, it's just this totally messed up thing. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to have a government that actually focuses on cultural things. So if you look at good governments throughout history, whether they're Confucian, Wu, or not, good governments actually fund good cultural works, right? And they actually go ahead and set examples for people to follow. They actually reform cultural practices. So the fact that you can get a courtroom marriage, I think, is a terrible thing because you don't have a ceremony, you don't have a ritual that actually symbolizes what it means to be a husband, what it means to be a wife. And if it wasn't clear to you by now, when I say ritual, I don't mean something that is religious in nature. I mean something like, okay, we don't have many of these left in America, and you know, they you have to go pretty back far, right? But one kind of ritual you could say is a funeral, all right? To leave roses at a gravesite is a kind of ritual, right? It's not religious. You don't have to believe in any god to do this, but it is a ritual thing because you show up and you're well dressed, and then you put a rose or a bouquet of flowers onto the casket or onto the burial mound, and then you might say a few things, and then you leave, uh, doing this respectfully and mindfully. Well, that's a ritual. And so the term Li goes anywhere from daily etiquette. You might shake somebody's hand. You might not be sure to not put your elbows on the dinner table. You keep your dog away from the dinner table, away from the dining room. Okay. And by the way, you should all not have your dogs inside the house anyway, for many reasons. But, um, anyways, you guys should be thinking about these things, right? We should all be thinking about these things a little bit more carefully. And if you live in the modern era, it's hard to do these things. I can assure you that I don't live up to, I think, even half of what I should. What I think about how important Li is, it's hard to actually live up to that, even partially. All right. So those are some real realities here, that you have a culture that is low trust because people are acting out and nobody has really a sense of shame. And nobody has a sense of shame because the people up there have no sense of shame. The people who have high socioeconomic status, who have political power, they have no sense of shame, no honor, no dignity, no righteousness, no moral principle, no integrity. And everybody knows that. And that has a complete demoralizing effect. Okay, it's literally reducing the morality of the people. Okay, it's not only that you feel bad, but it is that the people are less moral as a result. And then furthermore, because you have these petty people, these very superficial people there with empty souls running everything, because of that, they don't even if they knew they have to invest in good culture, they don't know what to do with that. They have no idea. Because it takes a good soul, and in order to get a good soul, you have to cultivate throughout your life. It takes a good soul to be able to even want to even notice that you need to culturally transform the people, and then to identify what kinds of works people need. Just because somebody enjoys a particular piece of music or other kind of or some kind of entertainment does not mean that that's good. So it's been happening for a long time now. You have, I'm going to talk about some old shows like Friends. Okay, the reason I don't like Friends but I like Seinfeld is not only because Seinfeld is much funnier, but because Friends glamorizes this sort of promiscuous life, and it makes no ontological sense. In other words, it makes no sense given how human nature really is. Right? I'm not saying that good cultural works have to be boring. They can be very entertaining. I personally like Sunny in Philadelphia because it makes no mistake in showing you that these are trashy people, right? They're trashy people and they are miserable, and that goes hand in hand. They don't try to pretend that what is evil and perverse is going to lead to happiness. They don't pretend what is evil and perverse is actually good and acceptable. They just show it for what it is. And last year, um, David Lynch passed away, and it was somebody who was very good at making something that was worth watching in terms of pure entertainment. But there were some good not messages, but it was good art in the sense that it really helped you explore spiritually what's going on with people. And yet, this person was not really well funded throughout his life. It's actually a miracle itself that he had any kind of funding, honestly, because it really goes so much against what Hollywood typically finds profitable. His works were not very profitable. All right. Something else, like Star Wars, and I personally enjoy that too, that's profitable. Now, the difference between, I'm paraphrasing Lynch, I believe, on this, but the difference between David Lynch and the creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, they both do what they love, but it's that what George Lucas does makes them billions of dollars. Because if you want to make something that is true art and is good for the people, that takes money. Otherwise, this person is just going to work for a minimum wage job. And because of that, you need a government that's actually going to support it. So if you look at America, if you look at all these problems socially, right? Not just economically. Economically, it's hard to make ends meet. Socially, it's hard to even get married and have children. It's because of all this hyper individualism that's going out there. This idea that you have to find yourself, that there's something to find. Instead of you are born insufficient and you have to build yourself into a good person. The whole thing is backwards, you see. It's all a completely broken system of ethics, system of understanding morality, understanding of human nature. You think everybody's born as an individual, you just have to find yourself, and that's going to mean happiness and peace. And that's not. That's the way to destruction. That's the way to chaos. That's the way to disorder. That's the way to unhappiness, for sure. In the short term, it might feel good to give in to whatever bad things that you want, but ultimately they're bad because they will hurt you, they will hurt others, and then they will eventually hurt you. That's how good and evil actually, in fact, work. What is good is orderly. There is no such thing as chaotic good. Okay? There might be good that doesn't abide by the government's laws, because if your government is unjust, to do what is good will inevitably cross what the government tells you to do. But what is good has an order to itself. So that's it in about a nutshell. There's much more to talk about, but politically, economically, culturally, that's what's wrong with America on a fundamental basis. And if we're talking about what's wrong specifically today, you've got that too. Happy 4th of July.